So we're absolutely delighted to have Kate Meierdiercks as our presenter this morning. Kate is also on the board of the Watershed Alliance, so does a lot of wonderful work keeping this whole organization moving. Teaches at Siena College, teaches a wide range of really interesting courses around earth science, environmental field techniques, water resources, hydrology and watershed management, GIS-based classes, among other courses. So, and has been at Siena for quite a while now. Kate, I think I'm going to leave the rest of the introduction to you, but we're delighted to have you here today. Thank you for making time in your schedule to be with us. The time is yours until 9:30. If you stop a few minutes early. Emily, do you want to talk about the Q&A policy here?
Yes. So if you have questions for Kate during her talk or after her talk, please put them into the Q&A box. That'll be the easiest place for us to monitor what those specific questions are. And then with time at the end for questions, I'll pitch those over to Kate.
So without further ado, Kate, the floor is yours. Thank you so much and welcome.
Great. Thank you, Emily and Russell. Okay, I will just share my screen here. Give me a moment. All right, thumbs up from Emily that it looks good. Okay, awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. This is really an honor. I'm so pleased to get to share some of the research we've been doing. And I know that I'll admit I'm a little intimidated. There's so much great work happening in the watershed, looking at road salts. So what I wanted to share today was specifically some work that we've been doing looking at patterns of road salt and impacts on water quality, specifically within the Hudson River Watershed and its subwatersheds. And as Russell pointed out, I am a faculty member at Siena College in the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences, and also on the board of the Watershed Alliance. And you know, as I was putting these slides together this week, I was reminded that I was supposed to present this research for Watershed Alliance Speaker Series back in March 2020. So it was actually scheduled for that fateful Friday, March 13th, up in Troy, and we had to cancel it. And so I was putting these slides together this week. I was experiencing a little bit of deja vu because I'm quarantined up at my parents' house in Vermont with while my kids are out of daycare. But as Emily pointed out, it's a little bit more hopeful because whereas back in 2020 we had to just cancel, now we're finally figuring out how to make this work. But I also bring that up because just in case we have a visitor, I have a 2- and a 5-year-old, and they're both very interested in this work, so they may make a guest appearance. All right, so this is what I want to talk about today. Just 3 things. Excuse me, I'm just going to move my panel up here. Okay, I'm going to minimize myself. So just 3 things today. I wanted to talk about some of the great work that's been happening looking at road salt and the spatial and temporal patterns of water quality impacts it can produce. And this is looking at a national view, so looking at trends in the United States. And then I want to focus in on some of the work that's been happening in the Hudson River Watershed by colleagues, and also present this work that I've been doing with colleagues and students here at Siena. And then talk a little bit about what I think some of the takeaways or implications might be for watershed communities, especially those that are trying to better understand road salt impacts in their watersheds and assess some of the water quality benefits of road salt management strategies they might have been implementing. And this work has been funded by multiple sources, so thank you to those. Okay, so some really general background. How does road salt get into our how do our surface waters get so salty? Well, road salt is one of the biggest contributors to salt in our surface water streams, especially here in the Northeast, right? We all know that we need to use road salt to keep our roads safe during the winter, but all of that salt can get into in surface waters, and it can provide some aquatic ecosystem impacts and impacts to drinking water. But salt also gets into our surface waters from a variety of other sources. So water softeners can add salt to surface waters, fertilizers, and then also recent research has shown that things like wastewater, sewage, and even weathering of impervious surfaces, all of those can also add salt to our surface waters. And so we know it's bad for aquatic ecosystems. It's not great for drinking. We don't want to drink salty water, but it can also be really damaging to water infrastructure. So if water is too salty, it can corrode pipes. And that was one of the contributing factors to the Flint, Michigan lead crisis. There was excess road salt in the Flint River, and it was one of the contributing factors that caused those pipes to corrode and led to leach out into the drinking water. Right? So there's lots of different reasons why we're concerned about having too much salt in our surface waters. And so there's been really a lot of great work that's looked at road salt contamination globally, but also here in the United States. So we know that road salt use has been increasing, especially over the last several decades, last 50 years or so. So this chart on the left shows that salt use and consumption has been increasing nationally. And then on the right, this green line shows specifically de-icers, right? So salt is in a lot of different sources. It comes from agriculture, food products, et cetera, but this green line shows that over the last decades, it kind of peaks here. This is 1982, that we really started to use a lot more road salt. And there's also work that's shown that New York State and so what that means is that salt concentrations in our surface waters is also increasing. So this is work looking at US geological data from throughout the United States, showing that in many parts of the United States, particularly the Northeast and the upper Midwest here, that salt concentrations are increasing in 37% of the continental US watershed drainage area. This study attributes road salts to the increases in the Northeast and fertilizers here in the upper Midwest. So we can see that regionally salt concentrations are increasing, and it's likely due to road salts. Another study that was looking at the rise in salt concentrations throughout the United States. This study was looking at these specific watersheds. You can see in this little tiny figure just to show the different watersheds included in this study. And what's being shown here is that the boxes that are the deeper red, those are the more urbanized. And this study was showing that, yes, there's increases in salt concentration in these watersheds in the United States, and that those increases can be tied to increased urbanization or urban development and road salt applications. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown, we're pretty confident that salt concentration is increasing with time, percent imperviousness or the degree of urbanization of our watersheds, and they're also increasing in the winter season. Those trends are pretty clear when you look at lots of different studies from across the United States. And this is not great for aquatic ecosystems and drinking water. So these salt concentrations are increasing, and they're increasing so much that they often exceed US EPA water quality criteria. So they're increasing with time, they're increasing with urbanization, and they've exceeded a threshold that's safe for aquatic ecosystems. And that's what's being shown here. Here is the relationship between urban land cover and salt concentration in the 90s, and then you look at the next decade, and that relationship has, the slope has increased, showing that the salt concentrations are increasing even with the same percent land cover. And there's been work done here in the Hudson River Watershed. Vicki Kelly over at Cary has shown that those salt concentrations can even increase. So the salt concentrations in our surface waters can even increase when there hasn't been any additional salt added due to road salt management. So you can, a community can decide to reduce the amount of salt that they're using, but you may still see increases in salt concentration. And this work is hypothesizing that what's happening is that the road salt used in previous decades is persisting in the environment. It's staying in our soils, it's staying in our aquifers, and then it's being added to surface streams through baseflow days, decades later. And so here's some work done in the Wappinger showing that salt concentrations increased even though salt use did not, due to this buildup and this lag. And so I'm a professor, so I have to have my summary slide here. So all of this research on road salt and water quality in the United States is showing some pretty clear trends. So we know that salt use has increased in the US, and we know subsequently that salt concentrations in surface waters have also been increasing. And the research has shown that things like urbanization, increased development, impervious surfaces, also proximity to roads do increase salt concentrations. And those concentrations are high enough that they're often exceeding the EPA criterion and New York DEC standards. And salt concentrations are generally higher in the winter. And then the really interesting thing, I think, is that this salt is also persisting in the environment. So even when you reduce salt use, there's still salt in the environment that is entering these surface streams. But the time scale that salt enters the streams can be really variable. So it can be on the order of days to years to decades. And I just want to acknowledge that there's been, so that research kind of describes national trends, but there's been a ton of really great and interesting research happening here in the Hudson River Watershed. So for example, a lot of this research has come from the Cary Institute that is looking at road salt trends in New York, and also other research institutes such as the Adirondack Watershed Institute. There's a lot of good work happening in the Adirondack area. And this work has shown that a lot of what's happening in the New York area matches national trends. So for example, work in the East Fishkill has shown that salt concentrations in groundwater, so they looked at salt concentrations in drinking water wells, and so there tends to be higher concentrations in groundwater closer that well is to a roadway. Work done in the Adirondacks shows that salt is increasing with increasing road density. And then work done in the Mohawk River shows that volumes of sodium and chloride have increased by 130 and 240% due to urbanization and road salts. So lots of good work here in the Hudson River Watershed. This work agrees with what we're seeing nationally. And I also want to point out that there's lots of great education, outreach, and policy work that's being done in the Hudson River Watershed regarding road salt. So Curie Institute, Adirondack Action have both put out really helpful, accessible guides talking about road salt impacts and management. There's been the Road Salt Reduction Act that's been passed for the Adirondacks, and also lots of work in the Lake George area. And I'm sure I'm missing some, so I apologize for other folks in the Hudson River Watershed that are doing this great work as well. And I also just want to give a shout out that Vicki Kelly from Curie Institute was recently featured in a New York Times article about road salt as well. So you should take a look at that. And so there's all of this great work that's happening. And this study is looking at something really specific. So there's been regional, national, multi-watershed studies. There's been work done in the Hudson River Watershed that have looked at specific watersheds or specific regions. This work is trying to do something very specific. We're trying to identify trends specifically in the Hudson River Watershed. So this work is really focused on the Hudson River Watershed. And it's a really interesting place to do this work because there are so many people looking at road salt, and there's some good data sets. And also because the Hudson River Watershed is so diverse in terms of land use. So I work in a watershed in the Albany region, the Patroon, and it's really, really, really urban. But there are also some really interesting agricultural watersheds in the Mohawk. And then you get down to the mid and the lower Hudson, and it's a mix of suburban and agricultural land uses. So it's an interesting place to look at diversity of land use types and whether or not we can pick up patterns of road salt contamination. And so the goal of this study has been to specifically examine how do land use and watershed structure control delivery of road salt to surface streams in the Hudson River Watershed. So we're looking for patterns of road salt contamination and seeing if we can tie those differences in land use within the Hudson River Watershed. And so the work that we've been doing so far has been characterizing Hudson subwatershed land use and watershed structures through geospatial analyses, analyzing salt concentrations, specifically quantified as specific conductance, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a few slides, why we're using SPC data to look for hotspots and examine spatiotemporal variability, and seeing if we can correlate some of those land use and watershed structure geospatial characteristics to salt concentrations and even fluxes. And so these are the study watersheds that we've been working with. So we've been working with anywhere between 24 to 29 watersheds throughout the Hudson River Watershed. And what we've been doing is compiling existing data from different sources. So we've been using specific conductance data from 18 US geological stations that collect specific conductance data for HRECOS stations. So the USGS stations are shown in blue here on the map. HRECOS stations are shown in brown. And then we've also been pairing that, those publicly existing data sets with data from independent researchers that are participating in the THuRST research network. So this is a collaboration of researchers that are working in their respective watersheds throughout the Hudson River watershed, but sharing common methodologies and resources so we can all do a better job at understanding water quality in the region. And then we've also been conducting GIS analyses using publicly available GIS data, including the USGS Stream Stats program. And this is a really big table, but I did want to show you all of the watersheds that we've been working with, especially in this first round of analyses. And I just put it up there so you can see if your specific watershed has been included in these analyses. And just to help you kind of make sense of it, they're shown from north to south. Okay, so we are using specific conductance data, SPC, to quantify road salt. And in the literature I've shared so far, most folks are using measures of chloride or salinity to quantify road salt. We're using specific conductance because it's been shown to be strongly correlated with sodium and chloride concentrations. So there's work that's been done in specific watersheds that shows that as chloride and sodium concentrations increase, so does specific conductance. But it's important to note that it's conductivity is really a proxy for road salts. It's a measure of the total dissolved ions in a surface water stream. And so the way that I think about it, I'm not an environmental chemist, so the way that I think about it, it's specific conductance is a measure of the total amount of dissolved stuff in a stream channel. And most of that dissolved stuff tends to be road salts. And so why are we using specific conductance data? Well, if you want to measure sodium or chloride, the main way that you would do that is to go out and collect a grab sample and then analyze that in the lab. And so that's a really useful technique. The advantage of using specific conductance data is that it's more easily measured using these loggers that can collect specific conductance data at a really high frequency time scale. So you can put out a specific conductance logger and it can measure SPC in your stream channel at a time scale of like once every minute or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. You can verify that using relatively inexpensive water quality probe. And so if you want to look at really fine time scales, or if you want to look at specific conductance concentration during a storm event, during a rainfall event, or a snow melt event, using these loggers can be really, really helpful for that. So there's a lot of benefits to quantifying salt concentration using SPC data. The Hudson River Watershed is, I just want to mention, it's can be a tricky place to do this type of work, both because it's tidal and it experiences a salt front. So most of us know the Hudson River Watershed is tidal as far north as the Troy Dam. So that means most of the time, the Hudson River is flowing downstream, but sometimes it can be flowing upstream. And so gauging stations along the river can actually record negative flow. It's also a complicated place for studying salt contamination because it experiences a natural salt front as far north as Poughkeepsie. And so there's lots of different ways to account for the impact of those negative flows and the salt front. What we did is kind of a quick and dirty method is that in our data sets, we removed specific conductance data greater than the certain threshold that represents the salt front. And then we remove those negative flow values. So, so we removed the impact of the Hudson River being tidal and the salt front by removing those data from our data sets. Okay, so what do we see when we look at salt trends, SPC trends in those watersheds that I mentioned? Well, the big thing that really stands out is that in most of the watersheds, 87% of the watersheds in this study, both salt concentrations and salt fluxes are increasing for whatever time period the stream gauge was its period of record. So we just looked at the data that we had for each of the stations and looked at trends in salt concentrations and salt flux. And so I just want to point out quickly the difference between concentration and flux. And one way to think about this is if you have let's say you have a cup of water, right? Like I have my coffee mug here. Salt flux is just the total amount of salt that I would put in this coffee mug. So you can think about it like the total mass of salt in a stream channel. And so this is important for things like mass balances or TMDL. You just want to know how much salt is in your stream channel. Salt concentration really depends on the volume of water in my cup, right? So if I just had a little bit of coffee in here and I put my spoonful of salt in there, then the concentration would be really high. If this coffee mug was all filled up and I put that same amount of salt, the concentration would be much lower, right? So the more water you have in your cup, the smaller the concentration. And that's important for things like water quality regulations and ecosystem health. So it's two different ways to measure and compare salt in a stream channel. But regardless, we see that the salt concentration and the flux are both increasing at most of our watersheds, So my background is in urban hydrology. I'm a hydrologist. I've done multi-watershed studies, trying to slice water flow or discharge data lots of different ways. So I was curious also to look at stream flow or discharge trends in these watersheds. And I will just say the trend here is not quite so clear. So in many of the study watersheds that we see that max daily and more specifically mean daily discharge is increasing. Again, just looking at the period of record for each of these watersheds. And that we see that the 7-day minimum discharge is decreasing. That trend certainly isn't clear, but I will just say that this trend also matches national trends. So specifically in urban environments, what the hydrology community has been seeing is that when it's wet, it's really wet, and when it's dry, it's really dry. And the Hudson River Watershed generally is following those same patterns. And so that's what is being shown here. Oh, and I will say with these plots, I'm just showing some example watersheds. So we've created these plots for all or most of the study watersheds. And so these are just example plots to illustrate some of the trends. So, so we see maximum daily discharge for the period of record, mean daily for the period of record, 7-day minimum. So this is like baseflow. And in this case, it is actually increasing. Same here for the Wallkill. We also looked at seasonal trends. So what's being shown here are monthly box plots. And again, I'm just showing some example watersheds. I picked out a few plots that kind of demonstrated these trends. And in all of these watersheds, we see this bimodal seasonal trends in salt concentrations. So in all of the watersheds, there tends to be a peak in salt concentration in the winter months, usually around February it peaks, and then another peak during the warm season or the dry season, peaking about September. And if I were to give this presentation back in 2020, what I would have said is, oh yeah, you're definitely seeing the impact of road salt here. But digging a little bit deeper, what we realize is that rather than increases in road salt runoff causing this increase in concentrations, these concentrations are really, really tied to trends in flow, trends in discharge. And I should just mention, I should have mentioned this earlier. What's being shown here is a box and whisker plot. So the line here is the median value, and then the boxes and the whiskers here are showing kind of the range of values that you would see in these watersheds. And so what's causing these peaks is not necessarily an increase in flux in salt. There's not necessarily more salt entering the stream channels during these months, but rather it's a reflection of smaller discharge values, right? So if you have less water in your cup, the same amount of salt is going to make it taste a lot saltier. The concentration is gonna be a lot higher. So we see this in all watersheds. This is a trend across the watersheds. Oh, I got ahead of myself here. So we see this bimodal response, just two examples, Mohawk and Wappinger. This is what I was going to show. So here we have the Mohawk peak in salt concentrations, winter, in the dry season, or warm season. And then these are tied to, this is the same box plot, but showing daily discharge. And so we can see that when salt concentrations are high, it's when you have the lower discharge values. Okay, and if it's kind of hard to see, I've been staring at these box plots for the past 2 years. So to me, these trends are clear, but if it's easier for you, I can show, this plot is just another way to say that SPC and flow are very closely related. Okay, so what's being shown here? Again, this is just an example. I have the Mohawk here, and I'm showing the relationship between SPC concentration and discharge for the period of record. This is SPC concentration, and this is flux, right? And you can see here that the flux is very, very highly correlated to discharge. So when discharge values are higher, the amount of salt entering the stream channel is higher. I've also broken this down by season. So here's our winter season, right? And if we were thinking that there was going to be a lot more road salt entering the stream channel in the winter or early spring, then what you would probably see is higher flux values for the same amount of discharge, and we just don't see that yet. And I will say that it could be right. So this is a work in progress. It could be that we just are not capturing surface delivery of salt during the warm season from snowmelt, from runoff during the winter months, because it's not happening. or we're just not capturing it in this data set. We just might not see it when we're looking at SPC concentration at the daily scale. And that's something that we're exploring a little bit further in the next phase of the study that I'll talk about in a few moments. So these results that we don't see, we're not seeing real clear evidence of surface runoff, delivery of road salt. That is supported by some of these preliminary GIS analyses. So right now we've done the correlation analyses just on a limited number of watersheds. My students and I computed a whole bunch of GIS, watershed, land use, drainage network characteristics for these watersheds. And so what we expected is that we'd see, based on what we're seeing elsewhere in the Hudson River Watershed and nationally, is that we expected to see salt concentrations being highly correlated with something like road density. Road lane density is one of the characteristics that we computed, and we don't see that right now. Instead, the watershed characteristics that are most strongly and significantly correlated with SPC concentration, imperviousness, soil type, basin slope, outfall density. These are all characteristics that have been shown to impact stormwater runoff rate and volume. So again, we're seeing a bigger, it seems like the bigger influence on salt concentrations is really storm runoff. So the one exception here is the Patroon Creek watershed up in Albany, and I'll show this slide really quickly. This is a land use map of the Patroon Creek watershed. The red areas are the developed areas. So right away, you can see that this is a really highly urbanized watershed. It is by far the most urbanized watershed of the 24 to 29 watersheds in this study. And so what we see in the Patroon Creek, so this is the outlier, what we do see is increased fluxes of SPC in the winter and spring months that are not tied to flow. So the hypothesis here is that Patroon Creek is the one watershed in the study where there's a real clear signal that road salt is entering the stream channel from runoff, and that's supported by some earlier work that was done looking at chloride concentrations close to roadways. And so I have to have my summary slide here. And so what this work has shown in terms of patterns of road salt, water quality impacts throughout the Hudson River watershed in the watersheds that we've been studying is that salt concentrations and fluxes quantified as SPC are increasing in most of the watersheds in this study. And in general, discharge maximum flows are increasing and minimum flows are decreasing, but that trend is not as clear. All sites exhibit this bimodal seasonal SPC response with the higher values peaking around February, March, and again in September, but they're not tied to increases in fluxes. Instead, they're tied to seasonal patterns of flow. And furthermore, we don't see that SPC is significantly correlated with things like road density. Instead, we see that they're more significantly correlated with imperviousness, soil type, basin slope, outflow density, all things that you would expect to be correlated with discharge values. And so what I hypothesize is that these results are suggesting that salt is indeed entering these stream channels, but that really the groundwater baseflow may be the dominant delivery mechanism. I don't see evidence yet of delivery by runoff, at least at the timescales that we're looking at. And then, of course, the one exception is the Patroon Creek watershed, which tends to be an outlier in this study. in the patroon, there is evidence from this work and past work that has shown that that salt is getting into surface waters through runoff from roadways. But this work is still very much a work in progress. So the next phase of this study, which we're beginning right now, is to more closely examine the utility of using SPSS as a proxy for salt concentrations in the Hudson River watershed. We're also going to dive down into a shorter temporal scale and take a look at storm event response and see if we can see, so at the daily scale, we don't see runoff entering these stream channels from surface runoff, but we may, if we zoom in a little bit and look at specific storm events or runoff events. And there's some great preliminary work from Zion class at Meierdiercks that's been shown, that's showing evidence of direct runoff. So we plan to explore that a little bit further. I want to expand the GIS analyses and include more watersheds and dive a little bit deeper into correlations with flux as opposed to concentration. And then pending funding, we're hoping to develop some community monitoring, salt monitoring tools in collaboration with the Watershed Alliance. And so, you know, this is I was happy to present this week because it's a great phase in the project to solicit feedback from all of the experts that are joining us today. So I welcome feedback at any phase. Okay, the last few slides are just talking about what I think some of the implications are of this work for watershed communities. And one of the biggest takeaways from this study is that we really, really need more long-term monitoring sites with continuous records. So this work is not possible if we don't have long-term data records, right? So if we're not seeing the benefits of our salt reduction techniques for decades later, we need data sets that span decades. And part of our study has been to see how well we can kind of piece together data sets from different sources across different timeframes, different decades, to see if we kind of piece those data together, what trends would emerge. But the gold standard, obviously, would be to have all of these stations recording the exact same data at the exact same time. And so the stations that are maintained by the US Geological Survey and HRECOS, they really need to be funded and supported. And I'll also point out that independent researchers, like those that are participating in this study, can be really helpful for filling in gaps where the USGS data or HRECOS data might not exist, but those also need to be funded and supported. So data is super important for this type of work. And I'll also say another important point to drive home is, again, that water quality improvements due to salt reduction strategies may not be immediately measurable. So let's say a community decides to implement some of these wonderful salt reduction strategies that have been researched and promoted. You might not see the benefits right away, and you might have to do your monitoring for many years before you see that improvement. Unless you're in an urban watershed like the Patroon, where you might see immediate improvements. And finally, another important point from this research is that salt concentration is really, really closely tied to stream flow or discharge. And so communities that are monitoring their stream channels to look at the impact of road salt contamination, or they do want to see whether or not there's improvements, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to also measure stream flow as well. And so stream flow is water velocity times the cross-sectional area. So a great way to do that for a community is if you're going out and you're collecting a chloride grab sample, just do an estimate of stream flow. You can do that by dropping a leaf into the stream channel and using that to estimate velocity, and then getting the width and the depth of your stream channel. And that's a great, easy estimate of flow. If you're not able to do that, even putting up a staff gauge, a permanent staff gauge where you can measure water depth over time would be a really quick and dirty estimate of changes in flow. So you can, at least you could look at relative flow, high flow versus low flow. And there's also loggers that will continuously measure water depth if you're able to do that. So a quick and dirty, it doesn't have to be a full-blown estimate of flow like the USGS would do. Just getting an estimate of whether or not it's low flow, medium flow, high flow is great. Okay. So some key takeaways from this talk for watershed communities is that we know road salt management strategies are good for our watersheds, right? So there's some uncertainty in the data that I've looked at, whether or not we can yet see some improvements from road salt management strategies, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be reducing road salt once we can, using it more effectively, sustainably. That's all great. But the caveat here is that not all watersheds will see the same water quality benefits in the same way and during the same time frame. So what's working in the Wappinger may not apply to the Wallkill based on the different land use types and dynamics of that watershed. SPC, so connectivity is an increasingly useful way to monitor stream channels for potential road salt contamination. But I just want to throw out there that SPC is a proxy for road salt. It's measuring all of those dissolved things. So we need to understand that it might be capturing other types of pollution too. And SPC data, though, is most useful when it's paired with stream flow or even depth measurements. And then final takeaway is that long-term water quality and flow data sets are critical for this type of work. And as a community, I think we need to really think about funding and supporting those monitoring sites. Okay. Thank you to everybody who's been working with me on this study, THuRST research partners and collaborators, all of the wonderful students who have been working on this. And I know I cited a lot of salt literature, so you can use your phone to scan the QR code, and there should be a Google Doc that pops up with all of those works cited. So I think that is it. And I will stop. Yep, I will stop and take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. Of course, as the train comes right by me, we have a lot of really great questions this morning. And so I'll just get started with a logistics question. Will your slides be available for people to view afterwards to get a closer look at some of those graphs that you showed? Yes, I can do that.
So I will talk to Emily about the best way to do that. I can either, if you scan this QR code and save the Google Doc, I can either put a link to the slides there, or usually Emily sends out resources afterwards. And I'm pretty sure a recording of this will be up on the Hudson River a YouTube channel, Hudson River Watershed Alliance YouTube channel. If none of those work for you, you can email me directly and I can send them to you. And I also have, I think the report that a lot of these slides came from, it's a WRI report, and that should be available online, and including the appendix. So the appendix has, I gave just kind of example plots, but the appendix is like hundreds of pages, and it has all of those plots for all of the watersheds in the study. So that should be, it's available someplace.
Great, thank you. And I see, there it is. Thank you. Somebody just dropped it in the chat for the panelists, so I'll make sure to send that out with the follow-up email that will be going out to everyone. So we've got a couple questions on sharing this information with municipalities in particular. Are there any training materials that might provide recommendations to town boards or municipalities that are maintaining salt storage facilities? And then I'm going to also bring in this question, where did it go, on if you would make recommendations for municipalities in regards to monitoring their local watersheds. So that's 3 conglomerate questions. Thanks for fielding them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in terms of guidance on management from municipalities, there's lots of great resources out there. I would start by taking a look at the Carey Institute and the wonderful resources they have. For communities wanting to monitor salt concentrations, I would first check to see whether or not there's existing data out there, either through the US Geological Survey or the HRECOS network, or even your local college or university. A lot of us are using these. They're not $0, but they're relatively inexpensive, the loggers that we put out in our stream channels to measure stream flow. If none of those data sources exist, then there are some great resources out there for community monitoring kits. If you do a little bit of searching, but that is our goal. One of our goals for the next phase of this project is to provide some additional tools for communities wanting to supplement these other sources and monitor their watersheds for potential impacts of road salts.
Great. In terms of what people are putting down on roads and the composition of what road salt is, in a lot of cases it's sodium chloride, but in other cases it might be calcium or magnesium. There are also, looking for this, anti-caking agents like ferric cyanide that might be included in road salt. Can you speak to any of the relative impacts of some of these other substances in road salt?
Yes, well, there's, I will say there's some really great work coming out of University of Maryland College Park, and a lot of those studies are cited in the work cited that you can access through that QR code. So they call them these chemical cocktails. So there's all of this different stuff that is impacting how salty our surface waters are, and all of that stuff interacts, and there's really some interesting and complex geochemistry that happens there. And so I will refer the participant to that research. I'm not a geochemical expert, so I can't speak specifically to that. But what I will say is that the advantage of using specific conductance data, SPC, is it captures all of that. It captures all of those dissolved ions, not just the chloride, not just the sodium. So, as our urban environments are growing in complexity with all the stuff that we're adding there, SPC is a really great way to capture all of that. The downside, though, is that you really have to then pick out what is from road salts versus what's from eroding impervious surfaces, what's from wastewater. So there's some positives and negatives. And this work that's coming out of the Maryland College Park is really diving into that. So hopefully there's some new advancements that would be directly applicable to communities shortly.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to just take one more, which is about seasonal surface water storage. So it's a comment, thought on low flow, high concentrations might be wetlands and other seasonal surface water storage discharging their winter input. Do you have any thoughts on that as a potential mechanism?
Yeah, that's another really complicating factor in urban environments. You have all these stormwater management strategies, not just wetlands, but things like rain gardens, bioswales. And yeah, there is a lot of research that has been shown that stuff can build up, and then you get a big storm event, and all that flushes out in like one big pulse. And so we're not seeing evidence of that yet in the research that we're doing or that we've done. But I think that when we, again, in this next phase, when we look at specific storm events, we may see some evidence of that. What's often called kind of like the first flush. So what we'll be looking for is, do we see like a really quick spike, either in fluxes or concentrations from a storm event, either just from stuff building up on the land surface during the winter and running off, or if we see salt spikes even in the summer months, then we know that stuff is probably being stored someplace in a wetland. And so we can look for that. And what I'm hypothesizing now is that we will see, and especially based on the work that's been coming out of Marist, is that we will see kind of those quick first flushes or quick pulses of salt in the winter, and perhaps not in the winter, but that they're just not being picked up when we're looking at salt at the daily time scale. So they're there, but they're small, and they're kind of getting averaged out in the data that we've been looking at so far.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I know we've got many more questions that we have time to answer. Thank you, everyone, for asking such great questions, and know that this is, as Kate mentioned, a work in progress. She'll have more results to share at some point in the future and is looking for community input. So ongoing study, and looking forward to seeing what the next stage of results might bring. So thank you so much, Kate, for your excellent talk. This will be posted on the Hudson River Watershed Alliance YouTube channel. I'll be sending out an email with links to the slides and that WRI report and the references as well. I know we had one comment that the QR code wasn't working, and so don't worry, we'll get that out to you. And thanks so much for your time and interest in this important subject. So have a great day, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Russell.